The Holy Gospel according to Mark, the first chapter. In those days, Jesus came from Nazareth of Galilee and was baptized by John in the Jordan. And just as he was coming up out of the water, he saw the heavens torn apart and the Spirit descending like a dove on him. And a voice came from heaven, "You are my Son, the beloved. With you I am well pleased." And the Spirit immediately drove him out into the wilderness. He was in the wilderness 40 days, tempted by Satan, and he was with the wild beasts, and the angels waited on him. Now after John was arrested, Jesus came to Galilee, proclaiming the good news of God and saying, "The time is fulfilled and the kingdom of God has come near. Repent and believe in the good news." This is the gospel of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Please be seated. What we think about God matters, so how we read the Bible matters. Since we live in a time and place where a life of faith is certainly optional, and since we cannot take faith or church or Jesus for granted, it's crucial for us to be discerning readers of the Bible. So let's be clear that we do not worship the Bible. We don't. We worship the God revealed in Jesus Christ, whose story comes to us in the Bible. As Martin Luther famously put it, the Bible is the cradle that brings to us Jesus of Nazareth. So we don't worship the cradle, we worship the one held in the cradle. Now, we can't cover every aspect and idea and thought about Bible reading in just a sermon or just one Bible study, but maybe think about this today like those samples given out at Costco. Maybe you're heading to Costco later today and you'll get those little samples, and they give you the sample with the hope that you buy the 20-pound pack and take it home. So maybe that's what today can be with this. So I want to explore the story of Noah and his ark in Genesis. It's a good starting place because it's one of those Bible stories that's so familiar. Many of us may not be able to remember a time when we didn't know the story of Noah's ark. So is this story of Noah and his ark just a kid's story? Or mostly a kid's story? Or is it even a kid's story at all? Well, I mean, take a look at this picture. How cute, right? It's Noah's veritable floating zoo of creatures 2 by 2. We got pandas, and we got some zebras, and of course monkeys, and oh Noah, why the mosquitoes, right? We joke about how Noah had to keep the foxes and the chickens apart. We discuss what he did after mealtime with all of the animal output. But the thing is, when we read the whole story in Genesis 6 through 9, it turns out that this is a flood story. In the story, everything gets washed away, except Noah and his family and a handful of animals. The rest is washed away. So I want to talk about 3 problems with the flood story in Genesis. Those 3 are literary, scientific, and theological. So first, literary. A question for us: how many of every kind of animal were brought onto the ark, according to the Bible? 2, right, we saw it in the picture. And, Genesis 6, verses 19 and 20 says this. God is saying here, "And of every living thing of all flesh you shall bring 2 of every kind into the ark, to keep them alive with you. They shall be male and female. Of the birds according to their kinds, and of the animals according to their kinds, 2 of every kind shall come into you to keep them alive." So sure, 2 by 2. We nailed it. It's just like that Noah's Ark play set you can buy at the store. Well, so it's all settled. Until we read into chapter 7 and encounter verse 2, which has God saying, "Take with you 7 pairs of all clean animals, the male and its mate, and a pair of the animals that are not clean, the male and its mate, and 7 pairs of the birds of the air also, male and female, to keep their kind alive on the face of the earth. Wait a minute. 7 pairs of clean animals and birds, but it just said a pair of every kind. As discerning readers, then, we have to know a little bit about how the Bible came to be and how different stories were told and written down and edited together over centuries and millennia. And we have to know a little bit about the worldview of biblical times and what sorts of questions they were asking. It's important for us to know that in our Lutheran theological tradition, we certainly hold that the Bible is divinely inspired. Yes, we can claim that. We do claim that. The Bible is divinely inspired, but we do not believe that the Bible is inerrant or infallible. Otherwise, you spend all your time running in circles around passages like that. So we'll keep this in mind as we move to the second big problem with the flood story, the scientific problem. Because if we think that the Bible seeks to adhere to our contemporary standards of historicity, which is just to say that if we think the Bible seeks to be completely factually and historically accurate, then we run into problems right away with science. And so I want to tell you about a 15-year-old who we'll call Matthew. He was a confirmation student in a previous congregation I served, and in the fall of his sophomore year, as we were approaching the day of confirmation, I received a fairly frantic phone call from his parents who told me, "Matthew doesn't want to get confirmed. Will you talk with him?" Matthew was a really smart young man. Really, really smart. I knew him and his family well, and his mom and dad were worried about him, and they were asking, what did we do wrong? They were concerned that their son had already checked out. I told them that I'd certainly be open to a conversation with him if he was interested, and Matthew was willing to meet and talk. He shared that his desire not to get confirmed boiled down to this. He wasn't sure that he believed all the things that confirmands get up and say they believe. He had lots of questions, and he was a science guy. He had a hard time reconciling stories in the Bible, perhaps like the flood, with scientific findings. I mean, for example, there's no real scientific or archaeological consensus that any sort of worldwide flood event took place in the era that the Bible describes. So, as a self-identified science guy, Matthew wasn't sure what he thought about it all. It's not even that he was against faith or the Bible or Jesus, he just had lots and lots and lots of questions. So I affirmed his questions. I talked about my questions. I talked about how valuable I think science is, how I don't think the Bible makes a very useful science textbook, which isn't the point of the Bible anyway. I told him I think actually science and theology work better together. So we had a good conversation, and he still chose not to get confirmed. And I supported him in that choice. Because you see, he didn't want to get up in front of the congregation and say that he believed in things that he really wasn't sure that he did. So I applauded his parents for raising a young man of integrity who did not want to stand up and tell a lie. Which really is kind of a faithful thing for him to do, isn't it? So Confirmation Day came, and Matthew came to worship with his family to support his friends and classmates. I mean, he was there as the 15 or so other sophomores stood up and made their promises and affirmed their baptism. They made promises to read the Bible and receive the sacraments, to live faithfully, to worship regularly, to work for God's justice and peace. Well, the next week came, and it's worth noting that, for whatever reasons, none of those 15 newly confirmed students were in worship. But Matthew was. Right there with Mom and Dad. He went on the high school mission trip next summer. He was always around in worship. He even chose a Christian university to attend when the day came. So maybe the confirmation box didn't get checked off for him. And I know he still has good questions. And I trust that God remains active in his life. And if we as the church can be clear about how we read the Bible, we will better equip the young people in our midst. It makes me wonder what confirmation can be, what it can look like today. You see, the Bible doesn't seek to be a history book as we think of history books, and it's certainly no science textbook. The Bible is trying to share the truth about God and wrestle with the realities of life. So we don't need to be afraid of inconsistencies or scientific inaccuracies, because that's not what the Bible's really about. I mean, truly, God calls us to a deeper reading, to be discerning readers, to not just give the Bible a surface reading, so we can engage the whole of the Bible, complete with its inconsistencies and its problems. Because we still have the biggest problem to face with the flood story: the theological problem, the problem of God. When it comes to the flood, what kind of God would do this? Genesis 7, verse 23 says, God blotted out every living thing that was on the face of the ground, human beings and animals and creeping things and birds of the air. They were blotted out from the earth. Only Noah was left and those who were with him in the ark. Now, you could say that the earth was so full of wicked people that this was a deserving punishment, and God was right to do this. But what about all the infants and children? What about the rest of creation? Are we okay thinking that God would have ever just washed them away? And yes, the story says that God sends the rainbow as a sign of the promise that God wouldn't send another flood. But what about the Canaanites in the book of Joshua? What about the Amalekites in 1 Samuel? You see, these images of divine violence in the Bible are troubling for so many of us because there seems to be an inconsistency between these images and what we heard from the Old Testament book of Joel this past Wednesday. And I don't just bring it up because it is impeccably named, but because this past Wednesday, on Ash Wednesday, we heard these words: "Return to the Lord your God, for God is gracious and merciful, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love, and relents from punishing." What we think about God matters, so how we read the Bible matters. And it's not an easy thing whatsoever to be discerning readers. But when we are, it makes it more real and relatable. It's not an easy thing, but life isn't an easy thing. You see, if for some reason we are untroubled by the image of God in Genesis 6 through 9, then we are likely untroubled by violence around us. If we are untroubled by the image of God blotting out nearly every living thing, we are likely untroubled by tragedies like last Wednesday in Parkland, Florida. Yet we are so very troubled and brokenhearted and stricken by such senseless violence and tragedy and loss. As people of faith, what we think about God matters, so how we read the Bible matters, especially in times like these. This picture from last Wednesday outside Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School is so devastating and so powerful. This is a more accurate portrayal of what God does in response to human brokenness than blotting everything out. Here we have the reality of death that's so prevalent, and the promise of the cross planted right in the midst of it all, right in the middle of the pain and heartbreak and suffering. God doesn't just wash God's hands of us, but God comes right to us, right among us. We heard the story of Jesus' baptism from Mark 1 today, and rather than all of creation being blotted out, God's deep love for humanity is expressed by heavens being torn apart and the Spirit descending like a dove on Jesus. We hear that God doesn't seek to wreck creation, but God will tear apart God's own heavenly accommodations to come to us. Which is what we see in this picture. There are no easy answers. There's no way to escape this heartache. But we do have the promise that God is with us, and God is enabling us to respond in love. You know, we can hold on to the image of God's rainbow, but let go of the image of a destructive God. The clearest picture of God we have from the Bible is not the flood, but the cross of Jesus Christ. Genesis 6 through 9 doesn't paint a full or accurate portrait of God. So we use the cross of Christ to help us find God's truth in the flood story and in the middle of our brokenness. Because in the end, what gets washed away is not almost all of creation and all of humanity. In Jesus Christ, what ultimately gets washed away is brokenness, sin, death, and evil. It is a flood. It's a flood of mercy and grace. And yes, today we have more questions than answers. But even more, we have a God who comes to us, who loves us, who is most fully revealed to us in Jesus Christ. And so we use our relationship with Christ to wrestle with troubling Bible stories. And we use the love of Christ in whatever ways we can to bless the world and share God's peace. Amen.